I'm Amy Goodman here with Juan Gonzalez as we turn now to East Timor, bracing for more violence today from militias armed and backed by Indonesia, with an announcement due tomorrow of the result of this past Monday's referendum on independence. The result is expected to show overwhelming support for self-determination for the people of East Timor, for independence in the island. The militias have effectively taken control of a number of areas in East Timor, the towns of Maliana in western East Timor and Lakisa, where a terrible massacre took place in April. Participating in that, militias as well as Indonesian military. Also Ermera, which is just a few miles south of the capital, Dili, where they're operating with impunity. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, Mary Robinson, is expressing concern over the violence perpetrated by the death squads, which have so far killed scores of civilians. Robinson's talking about a substantial UN peacekeeping force may be needed to protect, quote, the fundamental human rights of a terrorized population. Before we turn to Noam Chomsky about why Americans should care, just before the show, I reached Dili, East Timor, journalist Allan Nairn, to talk about the situation in Dili.
Well, I think it's normal. I think it's normal for Timor for most of the years of the occupation. In a sense, I think the international coverage I've seen is, in a way, exaggerated. In another way, not. I think it's exaggerated in the sense that it's not as if what's happening now is unusual for Timor. This is what the Timorese have been living with since 1975. Today was actually the first day that I got the feeling that the terror, in this case in Dili, had returned to the levels that existed, say, prior to the Dili massacre. The actual death toll around Dili has been higher than that time, but the feeling of all pervasive danger of death possibly being around every corner, that really wasn't there until today. But today, and that was always there, in 1990, 91. But today, every Timorese you heard about was fleeing their home, running up to the hills, because the militias, the army-backed militias, just in Dili, have been sacking and burning homes in the Bakora neighborhood, in the Komoro neighborhood. They've reportedly burned 200 houses, at least, in Maliana. The death toll of Timorese UN workers killed is now acknowledged to be 4, and 6 are missing. In the past 2 days, there have been telephoned threats to the UN civil police that the militias might raid the Dili Museum, where the referendum votes are being counted, and burn the ballots. Many Timorese tonight are sheltering in the homes of friends. It is a frightening situation for the Timorese, but in a way it's not an exception. I mean, this is what it's like in an occupied country where they've killed a third of the population. I only wish all these international reporters who are now getting all excited and who are now chartering planes to get the hell out of Dili, I wish they'd been here in 75 and 85 and 1991. If half of these reporters had been there at the Dili massacre, with their cameras running and immediate coverage, this nightmare could have ended a long time ago. In a way, it's kind of welcome to reality for all these reporters and international observers. This is the reality the Timorese have been living with. People in a number of countries, a number of U.S.-backed military terror countries have been living in these kind of conditions, and that's what's happening in Dili today. I think if, as many people are saying today, it really does happen that all these UN people pull back from the field to Dili. Many of the civilian, non-governmental organization monitors pull back from the field to Dili, and in fact leave Timor because many have to get back to school or to work in America and Europe and elsewhere. If many of the journalists who are now in the Hotel Turismo and in the Makota, if they get on the charters and hop out of Timor, I think that'll be very bad because it will really take away the screen of international presence that has transformed the atmosphere in Timor. I mean, it's been so different here with all these foreigners around. It really has provided a measure of protection for the Timorese, as bad as things have been. And now, if they all run away, it's going to be very rough for the Timorese. I also, it really occurs to me that, noting these 4 UN Timorese employees killed, 6 missing. Imagine if those had been American UN employees or Americans of any kind or British people. I think the international reaction would have been a lot different. I don't think, as of this morning, Clinton would have been able to still pump, money and military supplies into the Jakarta regime. But because they're just Timorese UN employees, that support for Jakarta can continue, even though there's apparently no shortage of finger wagging and empty words coming out of Washington and the Western powers. I mean, it's outrageous. Clinton can stop this right now, and he's not doing it. It's on him.
What do you make of Assistant Secretary of State Stanley Roth telling the Australian Broadcasting Corporation that Indonesia is capable of disbanding the militias and must face international intervention if it fails to do so? That's something the U.S. ambassador, the British ambassador to the UN, when I spoke to them in the last few days, were not even willing to say that the Indonesian military is responsible for these militias. We're getting the sense that the militias are now out of everyone's control.
Well, they're not. I mean, the militias are tightly controlled by the Indonesian Army Special Forces. It's actually been, if you look at it, a pretty finely calibrated operation. As one Western military person put it to me here the other day, this is a brinksmanship operation. Wiranto takes, with the militias, takes things up to the brink, sees how much they can get away with without paying a concrete price, and then they pull back a little. I don't think these militias are in any way out of control. I think they're very... they're on a very tight leash from Jakarta and TNI headquarters, and it's definitely true that Jakarta can shut them down. To talk about international intervention, though, really confuses things. Intervention isn't the right word when the problem is that international powers are feeding the beast, are feeding the TNI ABRI, the Indonesian army. Just stop feeding it. To stop backing it. They'll be terrified. That army is very dependent politically, in many other ways, on their international sponsors. And as soon as they know the sponsors are seriously going to cut aid, they'll stop. But they will not stop until that moment. It doesn't require intervention, sending in troops. It's not as if the U.S. and the other powers are third parties looking on at atrocities committed by some perpetrator they have nothing to do with. They're the quartermaster for the perpetrator. They're the paymaster. They're the people who make that army killing machine run. They've just got to stop supplying the fuel. That's the way to stop it.
Allan Nairn speaking to us from Dili, East Timor. And joining us on the line now from Massachusetts is Professor Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky, who has written extensively about East Timor since the Indonesian military invaded in 1975. Since that time, in this last quarter of a century, responsible for the deaths of a third of the Timorese population, 200,000 Timorese, and we see that killing continues. Noam Chomsky has just written a piece for the Mother Jones online East Timor section called Why Americans Should Care About East Timor. Welcome to Democracy Now!, Noam. Well, you've just heard Allan describing the situation in East Timor. Does anything surprise you about what he has said?
Afraid not. I think he's exactly accurate, as he's been for many years on this and other topics. That's exactly what's going on, and his crucial points, I think, are very well taken. The issue is not intervention. The issue is turning off the tap. The U.S. knows exactly how to do it. The U.S. supported Indonesia passionately through the period of its worst atrocities internally, its invasion of East Timor, while Suharto is compiling an outrageous human rights record at home. When the U.S. got tired of him, he finally did some things that the U.S. didn't like, namely two things, in the fall of 1997. One, he made his first two mistakes. He lost control, and that's no good. No use having your favorite dictator if he can't control the population. And even worse, he was dragging his feet on IMF proposals, which would have, in effect, destroyed the Indonesian economy, and he wasn't implementing them properly. Those were the two errors. The IMF flew in and ordered him in a very dramatic moment to sign up. In fact, there was a picture circulated all over Indonesia with Suharto sitting at a desk signing a statement while the director, Michel Kamdassu of the IMF, was standing above him with his arms crossed in what the press described as a typical colonial stance. And shortly after, in May 1998, Secretary of State Albright informed Suharto that the time had come for him to resign and provide for what he called a democratic transition. A couple hours later, that's exactly what he did. The U.S., it's not just cause and effect, but the U.S. understands very well how to terminate all of this. They don't need any instructions, and they don't want to do it. As Allan, and that's the most important point that Allan made. I mean, in much of this discussion about intervention and the last couple of months, there has been a really cowardly evasion, and we should avoid it. The evasion is to say, well, yeah, we're inconsistent, we have a double standard, sometimes we look the other way, but at least let's do the right thing sometimes. That's not the point. The U.S. government is not looking away. The British government is not looking away, neither in this case nor many other cases, many of them comparable or worse. Turkey, for example, right now, Colombia. It doesn't look away. It participates actively to escalate atrocities and violence. That's not looking away. In East Timor is a dramatic case because it's been going on for almost 25 years now. What's looking away has been the media and intellectual opinion, apart from a few people like you and Allan. But it's direct involvement. The U.S. has an overwhelming control. It's not necessary to bomb Jakarta. It's not even necessary to have sanctions. It is simply necessary to inform the Indonesian military that this game is over, just the way they informed Suharto in May 1998 that his game was over and it was time for him to move into the background.
Well, Noam Chomsky, this is Juan Gonzalez here. I just wanted to ask you, several years ago, I recall when Amy and Allan returned from surviving that massacre in Dili, I wrote a column for the Daily News about it, and the reaction of my editor at first was, East Timor, who ever heard of that? Why should we care about it? And I proceeded to try to explain to him. I'm amazed that a major editor at a metropolitan daily newspaper did not even know where East Timor was. What about this ability, this continued ability of the mass media in our country to totally ignore major human rights situations that are occurring around the world just because the U.S. government doesn't want to shed any attention on them, as you mentioned, what's going on in Turkey or Colombia, and why should the American people care about these situations?
The American people do care, and that's why the media keep it quiet. They know perfectly well that if the population knows about it, they're not going to like it. The American population will not easily accept the fact that they are contributing through their taxes and their tacit support to huge massacres. For example, let's take, say, Turkey. If the U.S. population knew that within NATO itself, not outside its borders, there was ethnic cleansing and atrocities and massacres going on a scale way beyond what was attributed to Milosevic in Kosovo, and that they were paying for it, and that the arms were increasing, thanks to Clinton, as the atrocities were increasing, you would have seen a public reaction, and that's why there's no reporting. Not that you don't know. I mean, you can easily find out. After all, these atrocities are going on in an area where there are U.S. air bases all over the place, including nuclear-armed planes. It's just not. And in fact, there are a few reporters reporting, like Jonathan Randall, who's a veteran Middle East correspondent of the Washington Post. I think he resigned a couple of years ago. But he's been there for years and has just written an excellent book about it. But that's not the story. The story that comes from Washington is concentrate on some particular enemy's crimes. And then you fly in and concentrate on their crimes, and you demonstrate, you show great concern for all the awful things they're doing and so on. Now, look, you saw this in Haiti. The orders come from on top, and that's where you go. Now, there are exceptions. It's pretty standard. And the East Timor is a dramatic case because it's been going on for 25 years. In fact, the coverage declined to actually zero in the national press as the atrocities mounted. The 200,000 killed figure, which is now widely accepted, that's a figure which was presented by very credible sources, church sources and others, back in 1978, at the time when the Carter administration was rushing new arms to Indonesia, and the atrocities were peaking with massive assaults, bombing, napalm, so on up in the mountains. But it was not the right topic. We were supposed to worry about something else at that time, somebody else's crimes. The current situation, as Allan pointed out quite rightly, I mean, it may look new to reporters, but that's because they weren't there before. If it's a continuation, it's not anywhere near the peak of atrocities. A couple of months ago, it was worse than it is now. Amy mentioned that the militia, meaning the Indonesian paramilitaries, have taken over Liquiza. Well, that was a town where just back in April, people were fleeing from the Indonesian-run paramilitaries. They fled into a church. About 60 were massacred in the church. Most of the rest were taken out and turned into effectively slave labor up in the mountains. A lot of the town was burned down. This is going on in April. It was widely reported in the press, namely the Australian press. There was no reason not to report it here.
Noam, we have to break for stations to identify themselves. We'd like to ask if you could stay for just 3 more minutes after that break. We're speaking with Noam Chomsky, who has written a piece most recently for the Mojo Wire, which is at www.motherjones.com, which is reporting extensively on East Timor right now, called Why Americans Should Care About East Timor. And we've just been listening to a report from journalist Allan Nairn in Dili, East Timor. By the way, I should mention that Allan is on the Army blacklist. He was able to secretly get into Indonesia 4 months ago. When I was deported last week, I saw his name on that blacklist, the red-bound book that has more than 1,000 names. Allan, who survived the massacre of 1991, where more than 250 Timorese were killed by the Indonesian military armed with U.S. weapons. In 94, we returned to cover Clinton going to Jakarta. He met with Suharto as well as his own campaign contributors. When we tried to get into East Timor then, we were arrested by the Indonesian military, though we eventually did get in. Allan went back last year, held a news conference in Jakarta, where he revealed documents that showed, once again, the United States military training Kopassus troops, the crack Indonesian military troops, in torture techniques and terrorism. And Allan was then deported from Indonesia and now has returned, has been there for about 4 months, and got into Dili as well, despite that blacklist. You're listening to Pacifica Radio's Democracy Now! We'll be back with Noam Chomsky in a minute. Our guest, Noam Chomsky, professor at MIT, well-known critic of U.S. policy in many areas, the Middle East, as well as Indonesia, Turkey. has written this piece called Why Americans Should Care About East Timor. It's interesting, Noam, to look at the coverage. Now, there is more coverage, although it almost never talks about the U.S. support for the Indonesian military and its occupation of East Timor. But we did see a change recently, not so much in tone, because Seth Midens of the New York Times on Monday had a piece where he talked about the Timorese playing victim. It was quite astounding how he put it, as he talked about after 24 years of war and propaganda, they know how to play the well-intentioned victim. And I could only think about right now how, well, the latest report from the Washington Post, about 100 people, including 25 journalists, being evacuated from Dili this morning, a British Broadcasting Corporation reporter beaten and kicked. When the reporters get not even a tenth of the treatment that the Timorese get, they get out.
That was an amazing comment. I saw that. But in fact, I think his general reporting is, the tone of it is pretty shocking. I mean, this morning, the pro-independence thugs and the anti-independence ruffians, as if it's some kind, as if that's the conflict that's going on. The same is true in other newspapers. For example, this morning's Boston Globe, where I am, the report, by not a bad reporter, talks about how the problem has been that since the Indonesian invasion, there has been a civil war and starvation. There hasn't been any civil war since the Indonesian invasion. There was a civil war for a couple of weeks before the Indonesian invasion. That was long over before Indonesia invaded. But that's kind of a more acceptable way to describe it. And as you say, nothing or virtually nothing about the fact that it's been a decisive U.S. contribution all along. The standard line has been, Washington Post, James Fallows, others, maybe we looked away too long and we should have become involved, but we were busy with other things. Or as the Wall Street Journal put it, we were overwhelmed by the tragedy of, our tragedy, of course, in Vietnam. Not the tragedy of millions of Vietnamese who were killed. But we didn't look away. Maybe the population didn't know, but the press knew, the government knew, and directly involved themselves in escalating the massacre. And in fact, they were pretty frank about it. Daniel Moynihan, who was the UN ambassador, boasted in his memoirs 20 years ago that he had rendered the UN utterly ineffective in anything it might do, because the State Department wanted things to turn out as they did. You could hardly find a more straight comment from right on top. It made no ripples.
But the change now in the New York Times, which is interesting, is that for years many people have been criticizing them for talking about, when they rarely reported on Indonesia, on East Timor, the dateline is Dili, Indonesia, as opposed to Dili, East Timor, but now it's changed.
Actually, the Boston Globe just changed it about 3 days ago. Up until then, it was Dili, Indonesia. But look, the Timorese are still called a separatist movement. I mean, what makes them a separatist movement? I mean, were the Kuwaitis a separatist movement after Iraq invaded? The framing of the issue and the complete evasion of responsibility, direct, crucial responsibility, those are striking, and they have to be overcome if we want to do anything constructive about this. To get back to Allan's point, which I think ought to be stressed. There is no need for punitive action against Jakarta. There is a need for the Clinton administration to tell them this game is over.
What is your sense, though, if the Clinton administration does not do that, of what may develop in East Timor over the next few weeks?
Well, I think Allan's prognosis is very realistic. The kind of continuing terror of the Indonesian-run paramilitaries is very likely to drive out all the Westerners. The reporters will pull out, except for a courageous few. They'll be taken out. The Indonesians will keep others out. The UN mission, not even allowed to carry sidearms. They're going to go out because it's too dangerous for them. And you get back to a closed territory where the Indonesia and its paramilitary terrorists can do as they please. They've already said what they're going to do. I mean, maybe they won't, but they've said that they're going to turn it into The commander of the military in Dili just a couple of weeks ago told the Australian national television that, I'll quote him, "I would like to convey the following. If the pro-independents do win, all will be destroyed, and East Timor won't be as we see it now. It will be worse than 23 years ago." Well, we can disregard what the commander said a couple of weeks ago if we like. But that could happen. And it's more likely to happen as attention shifts away. It's just the focus of attention that prevents it from happening. When the attention was withdrawn 20 years ago, that's exactly what happened with huge slaughter and starvation, comparable or worse than Cambodia or Biafra. And it could happen again.
Well, we want to thank you very much, Noam, for joining us today. And we want to let people know, again, there are things, as people could always do, and we've seen tremendous change, actually, happen around the issue of East Timor because of the activism in this country. As Allan has always said, people do all they can in East Timor. It is really up to us. But just President Clinton making it very clear that the violence must stop would make that difference. And if people want to call the president, remember his number. It is 202-456-1414. That is 202-456-1414. In addition to the Mother Jones website, www.motherjones.com, where you can get the latest on East Timor. You can always go to our website, www.pacifica.org. You can listen to the conversations we've been having with Allan daily in Dili, East Timor. And the ETAN website, East Timor Action Network, that lets you know about the legislation that's up before Congress, like Bill 1063 in the House, that would cut off all loopholes to military training of Indonesian soldiers. Again, Noam Chomsky, thanks for being with us, speaking to us from Massachusetts.